I'm sitting tight, huddled up against the freezing wind when I start to hear twigs snapping close to me. For no apparent reason, what is normally a rapturous sound indicative of an imminently successful hunt sent a frosty chill down my spine. I chambered around in my lever action 30 to 30 as quietly as I could and lay flat on my back tucked against a fallen tree. The rustling was moving closer through the fog, but I couldn't see anything. The sun was starting to peek over the mountains to my east and visibility was starting to increase. The rustling of twigs and leaves was sporadic, sometimes directly in front of me, sometimes behind or beside me. I remember laying there, rifle across my chest, thinking to myself how silly it was to react like such a coward. I rationed with myself that bears and mountain lions are a rarity where I was, and I had likely stumbled into a herd of whitetail that had bedded down. I decided to sit up. The rustling stopped immediately. As it was full dawn by now, I was looking through the fog for the outline of my prey, which I had assured myself was all around me. It wasn't. Seemingly, nothing was. By now, the fog had faded away and it was apparent to me that I was alone in those woods. I hunted all that day without seeing so much as a squirrel. Around 3 in the afternoon, after fighting the wind in an abnormally cold day and not wanting to hike out by flashlight, I decided it was time to start back to the truck. Walking out of those woods was the most uneasy I have ever felt. Lawfully, once you make it back to the trail, you're supposed to clear the chamber of your rifle. Not that day. What is normally a stroll through the woods, I undertook with the seriousness of an animal being stalked. I would walk, then stop and listen. I never heard or saw anything during my retreat, but I could feel eyes on me. I was about 100 feet away from my truck when I rounded the last corner and saw, hanging at a level from a tree by a noose, a stuffed bear in a blaze orange jacket. I'm a giant, broad-shouldered outdoorsman, but that one shook me something fierce. Story 9. My family moved into an old house, 200 plus years, when I was 10. Uncle, weird guy, was going to help us move in, and when we got inside the house, he got all weird and left. Always avoided coming for birthdays, etc. We always joked he saw a ghost, and for some reason, we nicknamed the ghost Billy. When my little sister started talking, she would say really weird things, like asking if we can shut our door at night so she doesn't have to see the boy walking down the hallway. Fucking creepy. Anyways, we thought she was also just being a big weirdo, so we continued to have this Billy the ghost joke. Something would get misplaced, must be Billy. A few years later, we ripped up the flooring because we wanted to go back to the original hardwood that had been covered up forever ago by old owners, and if you know anything about old houses, you know they used to insulate the floor with newspaper when newspaper just became a thing. Decided to read some articles for fun, some talking about the first ever refrigerators, really cool things like that. Until we got to the creepy part, a mentally challenged boy named Billy who lived in our home died while playing outside of it. I saw a lot of shit growing up in that house, but I'm not a huge ghost believer. The newspaper was a fucking creepy coincidence though, given that for years we had an ongoing Billy the ghost joke. Uncle also ended up telling us years later that when he pulled into the driveway and was outside of the house, he just got this awful feeling. Story 10. 12 years ago, my brother died, and for that whole first year, a lot of super weird shit happened to our family. The only conclusion I can come to, and I do believe this, was that he was trying to contact us. A week after his funeral, my mom was home by herself and the phone rang. This was about 2 p.m. The caller ID said that it was my brother's house, so she figured it was my sister-in-law. Mom answered, and when she said hello, there was no sound on the other end and no one answered. She said hello again, and still no answer. Then the call disconnected. She waited till about 6 p.m. when my SIL came home from work, and she called her to ask if she'd come home from work and called her earlier. My SIL said no. She asked if the kids had come home early. My SIL asked my niece and nephew if they had come home to call Gran in the middle of the day, and neither of them had. They were in school the whole time till the end of the day. The phone was mounted to the kitchen wall, and the receiver was on the hook, so it's not like the dog knocked it over and accidentally stepped on speed dial. We think it was my brother making contact to let my mom know he was around. My SIL is an amazing cook, and she has many kitchen utensils and tools that are very specialized, that you only use for one thing. For example, a certain knife you only use for fish or some such thing. Over that first year he was gone, many of the utensils that my SIL would use to make my brother's favorite dishes started to disappear. She didn't loan them out, no one borrowed them. I asked a friend of mine who's really into the supernatural about it. She said, "Does your SIL believe in ghosts and such?" I said, "No, she's super no nonsense and doesn't believe." She said, "That's the problem. He's trying to get her attention. He wants her to talk to him, he misses her, he's trying to let her know that he's still around." A year after my brother died, my dad's lady friend's father died. And a year after that, she was still having a lot of problems coping with her dad's death, so she went to a psychic to see if she could make contact with him. So the psychic tells her all the things she wants to hear. Yes, of course, your dad is in the room, etc., etc. Stuff that anyone could say to her. Then the psychic says, "Your dad's here, but there's a much younger man with him also. He's very tall and thin, with dark hair and glasses." Normally, Dad's lady friend would have thought of my brother, but she was having such a hard time coping with the loss of her dad that she just didn't make the connection to my brother at that exact moment. So she said, "That doesn't sound like anyone I know." The psychic said, "Who's James?" Dad's lady friend said, "He's my companion." The psychic said, "The younger man has a message for James." He said, "Please tell my dad that I'm okay, Dot." She realized it was my brother trying to give a message to my dad. The psychic knew nothing about my brother's death. Dad's lady friend was strictly there to talk about her father. 2 months after my brother died, I was kind of having a really bad day about his death. It was still very soon, and I was still grieving. I went out to Target in my neighborhood to run some errands, Sunday morning, very early right when they opened, and on this particular day, I had my hair up in a ponytail. I was going up the escalator to the second level, and suddenly I felt someone tug my ponytail, just in a friendly manner like you tap someone on the shoulder. There was one girl I worked with who lived in my neighborhood, and I thought that early on a Sunday in this neighborhood, it could only be her. So I turned around, expecting to see my coworker behind me with a big grin on her face, and I was alone. I was alone on the escalator. There was no one else on there with me, and the store was still mostly empty. 9 months after he died, I was in bed sleeping, and it had to be around 3 a.m. or so. Suddenly, I felt someone sit on the edge of my mattress. I felt the weight of this person sit down, and I felt the edge of the mattress dip. I gasped because naturally, I figured someone had broken into my bedroom and was going to attack me or something. I was laying on my stomach, and before I could roll over and see who it was, I felt this person lean up against me, very gently, like they were trying to hug me without waking me up and resting their cheek on my hair. I couldn't see anything, but at that point, I bolted upright and screamed and snapped on the light. There was no one there. You guys, I swear on my life, to this day, I could feel this person lightly hugging me. I could feel their cheek against my hair, and I felt the mattress dip down when they sat. It's been 12 years since he died, and to this day, there's been no way to explain any of this. Sorry, this was so long for my first post, but when I saw the topic, I couldn't help but register so I could post. Story 11. I grew up in the Great Pacific Northwest, in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, under the shadow of Mount St. Helens, in Washington State. It is a land full of myth and legend, mostly from the natives, but a lot from the old-timers such as the loggers, the trappers, the hunters, etc. One of my father's oldest and dearest friends, now passed on, was a local Native American who was one of the oldest of his nation. He was an adult before most of the towns in our area were settled by white people. His name was Charlie to us. I'm sure he had another native name, but I don't recall what it was. Charlie used to sit us down, both kids and adults, and tell us stories. Some of the stories were tribal legends, some of them were things he swore happened to him in the woods, and some were things said by the other men and women of his tribe or the fur trappers and miners of the late 19th century. As I got older, I began to realize that Charlie wasn't just pulling our legs on some of these stories. He genuinely believed them. And a few of them happened to me as I would wander out into the woods and investigate. The most obvious and easiest to prove was the ridge lights or mountain lights. Charlie called them by different names, and the locals to this day still tell some stories about them. The lights, according to Charlie, had existed as far back as the man had. They would appear around the mountains on clear nights and zip around in the air. One of the local legends said the lights were the spirits dancing and playing. I first saw the lights when I was a kid, and several times since then. To me, they fit the exact description of a classic UFO. Lights that appear to be some form of aircraft that flew in manners impossible for current aircraft. The last time I saw the ridge lights was in the mid-90s. I have noticed a distinct decrease in reported sightings of them since then, as well. But for a while, the western foothills of the Cascades were a hotspot for UFO sightings. Speaking of UFOs, it goes a bit further than just seeing lights. When I was a young kid, I woke up in the middle of the night in the little farmhouse we lived to bright lights outside. They were multicolored and flashing like police car lights, except I seem to recall there was green in there as well. I was curiously unafraid and walked out of my room into the living room, the kitchen, and eventually my parents' room. All the while, in all the windows, there were these bright lights. I tried to wake my parents up, but they were sound asleep. I shrugged it off, went to bed, and woke up in the morning. When I brought it up to my parents, they dismissed it as a dream. I accepted that, especially because of one odd part of my story. I couldn't wake my father up, and he was a Vietnam vet who normally woke up at the sound of a mosquito farting. The story would have ended there if not for our drunken neighbor. Some years later, when I was a teen, I was talking with the now-dead neighbor's granddaughter. The neighbor himself was known as a drunken lout and storyteller of the first order. Anyway, his granddaughter was telling me about how he used to tell these crazy stories, and one day he swore up and down that alien landed in his field and visited him in the middle of the night. I laughed and said I think I would have seen that, as our yard connected to his field. She agreed, saying something like, "You and your parents would have noticed a bunch of red, green, blue, and white flashing lights in your backyard 10 years ago." To be clear, I'm not saying I saw a UFO land near my house. I'm saying I may have seen lights that match the description of the lights on the supposed spaceship reported to have landed in my unreliable, drunken neighbor's yard. And then there's the big myth of them all. Sasquatch. Bigfoot. Whatever you call him. Do I believe he exists? Even though I consider myself a man who puts science before superstition. Why do I believe in him? Because when I was a child, I saw the footprints. My father even has a plaster cast of one. That was my first encounter. The prints were on the edge of a creek bed in a small ravine on a piece of wild property my father owned. We found them when surveying the property with a hunter friend. My father insisted it must be Bigfoot, to which the hunter scoffed and said a man could have made those prints. To demonstrate, this 6'6", 250-pound hunter climbed on a nearby log, took off his boots, and jumped down into the semi-soft ground. His size of 12 feet made a 0.5-inch indent in the earth next to the other print. The other print was a hand longer than the hunter's, and at least 1.5 inches down. It also had an odd big toe. It was splayed to the side, kind of like a thumb. My dad consulted Charlie for advice. Charlie told him to leave Sasquatch be, and Sasquatch would leave us be. Charlie also told us how to know when Sasquatch was nearby, nothing else would be, and sometimes you could smell him. He said if you could smell Sasquatch, it was time to get the hell out because he was a hell of a lot closer than you wanted him to be. Anyway, as the years went by, we learned to just hike out of the woods if they got dead quiet, and we didn't see any signs of other animals. Only twice do I think I smelled him. Both times it was a heavy, musty, almost moldy odor like old sweat or wet dog. The second time I was with a girlfriend, this was in my teen years, and I recalled something else Charlie had said: never go into Sasquatch territory with a woman who was on her period, because he could smell that and would track her, according to legend, to find a mate. It was the first time I ever asked a girl if she was on her period. She was quite embarrassed to answer that it was that time of the month. That was when I told her we needed to leave and we started the woods. We both swore we heard sticks breaking and branches rustling behind us the entire way out, and we both had that terrifying pit in your stomach you get when you know something is watching you. Story 12. 7 years ago, I lived in a 2-story farmhouse. It was built in 1908 and was both large and old. I was packing clothes and putting them in a small unused bedroom. I was wearing my MP3 player and, the last time I checked, it showed 3/4 battery life. I was on my 4th, or so, trip and was hauling a load of shirts on hangers. It occurred to me the closet was empty too. Perfect, I'll just hang them back up in there. This closet was almost a second room. It had a short glossy wooden door. The area was thrice as long as wide, with hardwood floors. The lacquer still smelled, even though I'm sure it was fresh 100 years ago. I ducked fully inside and thought, this is a weird little place to be. Suddenly, the music doubled in volume and changed to something that wasn't music. It was like, I don't even know, rapid nonsense. Fast electronic babbling. It scared the entire fuck out of me. I flew straight out, looked at my player, and it was dead. I'm a pretty rational guy. That MP3 player would sometimes show more battery life than it had. It's done that before. And maybe the sounds were some sort of malfunction before shutting down. I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm telling you, it shocked and frightened me to the core. My skin felt electric for an hour after. I never felt comfortable in that room again. Story 13. My wife and I were asleep one night and I woke up suddenly and felt like someone was at the foot of our bed. I opened my eyes and saw a woman standing there who looked just like this at the foot of my bed. She slowly turned towards me and just stared. Not being fully awake yet, my brain couldn't get fully afraid but was instead curious and confused as to why there was another person in the room. I sat up and reached toward the woman, trying to figure out if she was real or not. When my hand reached her face, she disappeared. My wife woke up at this point and asked me what I was doing. All I could say was that I thought I saw something. We both lay back down facing each other and closed our eyes. Not a minute later, we both heard this guttural roar/growl that sounded like a mix between a bear, lion, and howler monkey emanating from behind our headboard. There's nothing behind that wall since it's an outside second-story wall. She immediately began screaming and I searched the house from top to bottom. We never found out what made that noise. Took us a while to sleep in our bedroom again. Story 14. Around the time I was a sophomore in high school, my parents decided to tear down our house and rebuild, seeing as a lot of people in our neighborhood were doing the same for value purposes. I had made multiple jokes about how cool it would be to get a secret room that no one knew about, but I didn't expect them to take any of it into consideration. Turns out, they worked with the contractor and ended up having an area set aside. If you were looking inside my closet and turned right, you could walk to the corner where there was a 1.5-foot bar to hang clothes. If you moved those clothes, there was a wall behind that you could push open and find the hidden room, fully equipped with a ceiling light and electric plugs. Imagine how many games of hide and seek I won. No one ever found me. The room was my precious secret and I wasn't going to share it with any person outside of my family. Unfortunately, after a few months passed by, I began to get tired of the room. First of all, trying to squeeze past all of the clothing proved to be a pain. Then I'd have to slide through the tiny space to get into the room, which wasn't all that big itself. The magic had worn off. So, I stopped entering it. Fast forward to a couple of months later when things began to get weird. Our family had left for vacation for 2 weeks, so we had one of our neighbors take care of the house. We had been having a lot of crime in the area, so she occasionally stopped by just to check. When I had gotten back home, I was exhausted and wanted nothing more than to crawl into bed. Opening the door to my room, which was dark, I noticed that something was off. I could see a faint glow coming from underneath my closet door. Okay, I thought to myself, my neighbor must have been going through my stuff. So, I walked over to turn off the light, only to realize that the closet light switch was facing down. Confused, I opened the door, and to my horror, I noticed that, in the corner, all of my clothes had been shoved aside, the wall to my secret room has been pushed open, and the light was on. How was this possible? No one knew of that room other than my parents and the contractor. I stood there in utter disbelief for about a minute until I realized my neighbor must have explored the place. I warily made my way to turn off the light, followed by putting the wall door back in its place and moving the clothes back to their normal formation. I'm going to try and explain what happened next as best as I can. Still kind of freaked out, or at least confused, I start to exit my closet. I'm standing in its frame, looking across my room into the corner, where I have an iron floor mirror. I'm looking at my reflection when I notice that the closet space behind me suddenly lights up and I hear this scraping noise. Or at least I think that's what it was. My heart had been pounding so hard that my ears could only hear the rush of blood with every beat. I just remember jerking my head back inside my closet to find that all my clothes were moved aside, the wall was pushed open, and, you guessed it, the light to the secret room was on. Once I was able to move from my petrified state, I convinced myself that I had been so confused when I had initially seen the secret room open that I had not closed it back at all. But I know that I was lying to myself. Throughout the next few months, weird things kept happening. They weren't anything major, but still weird to the point where I couldn't explain them. For example, I would walk into my bathroom only to find that my toilet seat was being left up. Every single time. I was assuming my dad was coming into my room to use it, but that would mean he had a serious case of an overactive bladder. When I approached him about it, he looked at me as though I were crazy and asked why he would use my bathroom when we had one down the hall. I couldn't answer that question. There were other instances when I would wake up in the morning only to find that, on multiple occasions, my closet door was wide open. Before any of you say that's not a big deal, let me clarify that I had been slightly terrified of my closet and made sure every night that its door was closed before I went to sleep. I would check to make sure I heard the click and pull back and forth a few times to prove it had been shut all the way. There was no reason it should be wide open. And there was also no explanation for why, occasionally, the light was turned on in the middle of the night. I know, malfunctioning lights and toilet seats don't come off as scary, but bear with me. I was freaked out to the point that I finally approached my mom about it when we were both working in our downstairs office one day. Background story on her, she doesn't believe in ghosts whatsoever. She raised me and my older brother, who had moved out since we had lived in the new house, to think that any person who believed in ghosts was crazy. So when I tell her of my suspicions, I'm surprised when she sighs and says she's noticed weird things have happened too. She continued to tell me how when we first moved into our house, the one we tore down, she would always hear footsteps walking around in my brother's room. This would confuse her because he was at school every time this happened, but she could have sworn she heard him running around. One time when she had walked up, toys were sprawled across his carpet. This took her by surprise because he hadn't left his room like that before heading out. She then goes on to explain that the previous owners of the house had a young son that died in my brother's room, which is what led them to sell the house, which she never told me about before. I'm guessing she thought I was old enough to know now and not form any irrational stories about ghosts haunting our house. If that had been her goal, I hate to inform her that it did not work. At this point, I am now positive that our house is haunted. She wrapped up her story and laughed it off as though it was silly to believe that there wasn't a logical explanation for weird things happening. The footsteps coming from the old house were because it was old. The lighting and toilet issues were stemming from the fact that the house was brand new. Yeah. Okay. At that point, we swivel around in our office chairs and continue working on our computers. After a minute or so, I can hear this loud, almost white noise sound. I turn to my mom, thinking she was taking a break and watching some weird video when I notice she's looking at me with the same confused face. "It sounds like your shower is running," she said. My bedroom/bathroom was directly above our heads. Our dazed expressions stem from the fact that my shower hadn't worked for a good month or so. New houses come with a lot of problems. Right as she said that, the water stopped running and things went silent right before we heard 5 loud footsteps. I just remember seeing my mom turn white and immediately bolt upstairs, past my dad who was sitting on the couch watching TV. I finally joined her, only to find that she was looking in my closet, under my bed, everywhere. She had tried to explain to my dad what she had heard, but he insisted it was some piping issue. And she eventually believed him. No, it was piping. I just kind of stayed upstairs, accepting the fact that something weird, but probably harmless, was occupying my room. I was thinking about everything that has happened. I realized that my current room is exactly where my brother's old room used to be. I know that's not how hauntings work exactly, but it makes for a better story explanation, yes? Story 15. I'm not a believer in the supernatural, but my mom is, and so is her side of the family. One of the things that stuck to me as an oddly rational argument was to never allow a room to remain unoccupied or unused/undisturbed for very long. The non-supernatural argument for this was that in a large house with too many rooms, you may have vagrants and deranged people hiding in your house. Animals would get in and occupy the space, or some kind of damage will happen, mold, water damage, etc., and go unnoticed for too long. If it can't be helped, I was told at the very least a vacant room should be used for pets, food bowls, beds, toys, etc., so that you would be forced to enter the room frequently and keep it clean. The supernatural side of the argument was that a vacant or unused room would eventually become occupied by spirits. The living exerts a kind of force that disturbs and repels spirits, preventing them from settling in. But if the room is empty for long enough, the spirits can take over, and because it has essentially become their home, they will be more aggressive and persistent in staying or in forcing the living occupants to leave so that they can claim more territory. So, if you're into believing that sort of thing, the boys' room was unoccupied for too long, and so the spirit settled.